Today's video, we're going to be talking about low light. Again, low light is one of those things where a lot of people make their camera buying decisions on how well the camera performs in low light situations. But instead of talking about tech specs, I actually want to talk about low light filmmaking in general and give you guys 6 different tips that you could use in order to make you a better filmmaker when it gets a little bit darker. We'll get to it. Now, this has nothing to do with your camera or lens selection, but picking the right location for low light filmmaking situations is going to be essential to overall have a better shoot. Now, I understand people don't necessarily always have the control over the location that they're going to shoot at, but when you do, you want to make sure that you have a lot of practical lighting that you could use towards your advantage. Now, in this particular gym location, there was these big red lights, and at first I wanted to turn them all off and add my own lighting in, but I decided to leave them in because they were more interesting. On top of that, there's some house lights in the ceiling as well, and what I like to do is I'm going to try to adjust my camera settings and my setup in order to complement the lights instead of shying away from them all the time. Now, even though you don't have a chance of picking a location, having some exposure out of the house lights or the ambient lights in the room is going to be better than nothing. Now, when you're shooting in low light, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no light, and essentially it just kind of means that most of your frame is going to be underexposed. No matter what camera you're going to be using, even if it could go to 12,800 ISO, shooting in pitch darkness is never going to be the move. And if you could find a way to use your location to your advantage, or if you have control over the location in general, you're gonna go a long way. There's a couple of different ways that you could use the ambient or house lights, and that's actually gonna be where you position your talent or your subject. Now, me personally, I don't like using the inaccurate lights that you might find in buildings or might find in somebody's house as your key light, and I want to start to adjust things, which we'll talk about later, but the positioning of where I put my subject is I put it in front of the light, and that's a technique called backlighting. Now, this gym had big red lights in it, and if I used it as a key light, then all my skin tones would have been red, which really isn't a good look. So what I did was I put my subject between myself and the light source that you could actually see, which is the red lights that are going to be against the wall. And then in most of my coverage, I tried to avoid using that as a key light so Kevin's face didn't turn completely red.
All right, so if you think that all brothers look the same, then here's where you're going to be wrong. Because this is Kevin Yaboa. Now, this person has less hair than I do, even though that's not by much, but he's significantly more shredded than I am.
Now, you might not be in a location with RGB lights across the wall. In fact, you probably are unlikely to be in that situation. But there is one more thing that I like using to my advantage, and that's going to be top-down lighting. Now, in this gym, it not only had the RGB lights against the wall, but there was also house lights in the ceiling. And using top-down lighting for me is an interesting way to light up your subject. Now, this location already had it built in, but if you're someone that shoots outside, using things like street lights or even the fluorescent tubes that are inside of a location actually might give you some adequate top lighting. It's also out of frame and it looks natural, so if you are capturing scenes in different locations with top lighting, it actually might work to your advantage. Now, speaking of dealing with lights in your location, you want to make sure you're adjusting your white balance correctly. Now, if you look at your white balancing settings, there's actually different presets depending on the conditions that you're in. So for example, if you're in a location with fluorescent lighting, you actually have a white balance preset for that. And if you're someone that's on a cinema camera, you could use a custom white balance in order to adjust certain things. The reason why you want to do that is if you're dealing with practical lights in a location and you don't really have a lot of options, at the very least you want to have the proper color accuracy and tone in your image. That way, if you move on to this next step that we're going to talk about, things are a little bit more accurate and it's going to help you out a bit. But if you're someone that's running around with no lights, you want to make sure you're adjusting your white balance even if you're in a darker situation. Now, for this shoot in general, I did lean more into the 2700 to 3000 Kelvin mark. The reason why I wanted to do that is not to match to the red RGB lights in the room, because that would be hard to do with the white balance scale, but I wanted to match to the house lights that are at the top. Now, these lights do kind of sit a little bit more yellow, so I did drop my white balance down in camera in order to make it a little bit more neutral and to overall help my look. And if I didn't, things would be a little bit too red, which I really didn't want. Now, speaking of color, we're going to use our next tip, and that's actually going to be color contrast. Now, color contrast isn't often talked about when we're talking about low light filmmaking, but if you ever see a color wheel, which you probably have at some point in your life, if you draw a line right through it, you're going to land on opposing colors, and that's going to be something called a complementary color. Now, if you watch any Hollywood film, and you probably hate the way that people grade, but teal and orange is used for a reason. If you go onto a color wheel, they're fairly on the opposite sides of that spectrum, which means that when you put it into an image, there's a little bit more pop to it. Now, we're going to go back to the red lights in this room. And the opposite of red is going to be cyan. So what I did was I actually brought out my Namlight Pavo tube and I set it to its blue cyan setting to add more pop and dimension from my subject. The reason why you might want to do that is if you're in a low light situation, one thing that you can do is get a color that complements whatever ambient light or whatever practical light is around. You can set up your light that it complements or even contrasts to the practical lights that are in the room. So even if something is very, very dark, the thing that's going to pop out is the opposing color, which is overall going to help you expose for your subject. Now, there are a couple of things that you can into that are a little bit more obvious for low light filmmaking. Number one is going to be just using lower apertures or lower f-stops. Now, generally speaking, 2.8 is going to be a great all-around lens, but if you're in low-light situations, it might get a little bit weird. So I tend to go with 1.8, 1.4, or even sometimes 1.2 for my aperture in low-light situations. The only hard part is that you're going to have a hard time getting manual focus, and a lot of things aren't going to be super sharp. So you want to adjust your aperture to make sure that you get the best sharpness in terms of your focus, but at the same time, you're going to get a better exposure than using something like 2.8 or above. Now, one thing that I recommend not doing is touching your shutter speed whatsoever. You still want to have realistic motion blur in a lot of these images, and if you turn things up in order to compensate for the underexposure, it's gonna get a little bit blurry. Now, before we talk about ISO, because I do use that as my last resort, if you're somebody that has an FX line camera, using lower CineEI values is going to help a lot with low light filmmaking. Now, a lot of digital mirrorless cameras are gonna be great in retaining highlight information in the dynamic range. So using something like a lower CineEI value is going to help you get lower stops into your shadows, which ultimately is what low light scenarios are made out of. Now, you don't necessarily have to have CineEI in order to do this. Generally speaking, it's just a tool that'll help guide you into overexposing your image so you can bring things back in post with the most dynamic range and the minimal amount of noise. And now my absolute last resort when I'm shooting in low light and I do need more exposure is bumping up my ISO. This is something I actually don't like doing because it does introduce a little bit more noise than what I had bargained for. However, a lot of cameras nowadays have something called a dual base ISO. Now, you might need to research this depending on which camera that you're using, but there's two ISO values that cameras actually perform the best at least in the ones that have come out recently. For example, the Sony FX30 has a dual base ISO at 800 and 2500, where it's going to perform the best. And the Sony a7 IV that I'm shooting on right now has 800 and 3200. Now, what that basically means is that I have two ISO values that I can flip to depending on my situation. And obviously, in low light situations, when you need that extra boost, you could flip up to the second base ISO, and I would try to avoid using anything in between because it might give you less dynamic range and it also might have a little bit more noise. Now, this might also be important in terms of shooting low light footage, and it actually might be just leaning into the darkness. I'm gonna try that one again. Sometimes having an underexposed subject is actually a good thing, and using techniques like backlighting is gonna give you a more dramatic and more cinematic type of look. In the last couple of shoots that I've done, I've started to lean into silhouetting my subject because it makes things a little bit more interesting, especially when they're doing some sort of an action. And when you're working in low light, you might not have control over your location, and this might be a tool that you can use to give you a more dynamic image. So basically what I'm trying to say is that if you can't beat the low light, you may as well join it and make it work for you. Now, I do have one more X factor, especially when I'm shooting in low light, and that's gonna be shooting in anamorphic. If you wanna see more about that, you can check any one of the two of these videos over here.